He thought he could whisper me out of existence. But his mic was on, and I was the only reason the company hadn't collapsed already. So I let go and watched the system choke on its own secrets. My name is Jenna Rowe. At 38, I'd spent the last 5 years as the lead systems infrastructure architect at Nexora Systems, a tech startup headquartered in Portland that had grown too fast for its own good. Most people don't understand what I do, which was precisely the problem. I build digital skeletons that hold companies upright, design the nervous systems that keep data flowing, and create the invisible architecture that everyone depends on but nobody sees. Until it fails. I just finished a 72-hour emergency patch deployment to prevent data loss for nearly 1 million users. 3 days without real sleep, surviving on espresso and determination, because no one else could do what needed to be done. My eyes burned as I stared at my monitor, the familiar fatigue settling into my bones as I joined the company-wide Zoom meeting from my apartment. The Portland rain tapped against my window, a gentle rhythm contrasting with the chaos I'd just contained. Reed Callahan, our CEO and founder, dominated the screen with his perfect smile and carefully disheveled hair. He was in the middle of one of his trademark monologues about strategic pivots and market-responsive frameworks. The kind of corporate poetry that impressed investors but meant nothing to those of us who actually built and maintained the product. Which is why our Q3 roadmap is being realigned to capitalize on emerging opportunities in the enterprise sector. Reed continued, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who'd perfected the art of sounding knowledgeable about things he didn't understand. I took a sip of my tea, barely listening. My team had sent supportive messages through our private Slack channel, congratulating me on the system rescue. They knew what I'd accomplished. Reed probably didn't even know we'd been on the brink of catastrophe. That's when it happened. Reed leaned toward his camera, his expression shifting to something more intimate, conspiratorial. He was clearly attempting to whisper to someone off-screen, likely Darren Fisher, our COO, who often hovered near Reed during these calls. Let's just fire her after this. Quietly. My fingers froze above my keyboard. The meeting continued, but Reed's voice had cut through everything else. I checked my audio settings, thinking perhaps I'd misheard, but the Slack channel exploded almost instantly. Marcus, did he just say that out loud? Louisa, his mic is on. Jenna, did you hear that? Brian, what the actual Reed continued his presentation, oblivious to what had just happened, oblivious to the fact that his microphone had broadcast his whisper to the entire company. Oblivious that I and everyone else had heard his plan to dispose of me less than 3 days after I'd saved his company from disaster. My first instinct was anger, a hot flare that threatened to consume my exhaustion. My second was hurt, a cold needle that pierced deeper than I expected. But my third reaction, the one I chose to act on, was calm. Clinical calculation. I opened my personal email account and composed a new message while Reed droned on about synergistic opportunities. The message was simple. You've made your decision, so have I. I attached my letter of resignation, effective immediately, before sending it. I texted Brian and Louisa, the 2 senior engineers who had been with me from the start. Both responded within seconds, confirming what I already knew. They would follow me out. At 11:26 a.m., while Reed was mid-sentence about team cohesion, 3 resignation emails hit the inboxes of every member of the leadership team. Mine, Brian's, and Louisa's. No drama, no accusations. Just 3 vital organs of the company simultaneously shutting down. I didn't wait for the reaction. I left the Zoom call without announcement, closed my laptop, and walked to my kitchen to make another cup of tea. My hands should have been shaking, but they weren't. 5 years of my life had just ended, but I felt strangely light. Before disconnecting completely, I did what any responsible systems architect would do. I prepared for contingencies. I didn't sabotage anything. I'm a professional, not a vandal. But I did ensure I maintained 2 hidden access points, a shell key buried in an administrative layer nobody else knew existed, and a DevOps credential linked to an API gateway from one of our partner vendors. not to damage anything, just to watch, and perhaps to maintain proof of what I'd built. Then I logged out of the Nexora system for what I thought might be the last time. I deleted the company apps from my phone, muted the email notifications, and walked away from my computer. I had planned to take a long, hot shower and then sleep for about 14 hours. Instead, I found myself on my balcony, watching the rain and eating raspberries from a bowl balanced on my knee. The first text came 27 minutes after I'd sent my resignation. "Jenna, please call me. This is a misunderstanding. Read." The second came 4 minutes later. "Whatever he's offering, I'll double it. Darren." I didn't respond to either. They didn't deserve my attention. And more importantly, they still didn't understand what was happening. They thought this was a negotiation. It wasn't. It was an extinction event that hadn't fully manifested yet. By evening, the messages had grown desperate. Not just from Reed and Darren, but from product managers, team leads, even board members whose contact information I didn't even know they had. Each message revealed another system beginning to fail, another piece of infrastructure showing cracks without my constant maintenance. The Slack integration was the first to go. Without my credentials, certain admin functions couldn't be performed, and the custom workflows I'd built began to throw errors. Then the code repositories started to become inaccessible, not because I'd locked anything, but because the authentication protocols required periodic renewal that only I knew how to properly execute. By nightfall, the staging environment could no longer accept build pushes. None of this was sabotage. It was simply the natural consequence of removing the only person who fully understood how everything was connected. I had documented everything. Of course, I'm nothing if not thorough, but my documentation assumed a baseline understanding that no one else at Nexora possessed. It was like leaving detailed instructions for flying a plane to people who had only ever driven cars. On day 2, I woke to an email notification that made me smile despite myself. The new technical director, a front-end specialist who had once asked me if databases had pixels, had scheduled an emergency meeting titled System Stability Emergency Rebuild. I could picture the scene: a room full of increasingly panicked executives and engineers, staring at systems they didn't understand, trying to reconstruct my work without my blueprint, like archaeologists attempting to rebuild a spacecraft from fragments. By mid-afternoon, I received confirmation that my predictions were coming true. A former colleague who still had loyalty to me forwarded an internal email chain. Nexora had attempted to renew an API key with one of our vendor partners, but the vendor had rejected the request, flagging it as potentially unauthorized access. This had triggered a legal review. The house of cards was falling, each collapse triggering another. Not because I'd pushed it, but because I'd been the invisible hand holding it up for years. That evening, as I sat on my balcony again, watching the sunset paint Portland's skyline in shades of amber and pink, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. "Are you available for short-term consulting? Urgent situation. Compensation negotiable." It was from Maxwell Jang, apparently the newly appointed CTO of Nexora. I hadn't even known they'd hired one. It had been less than 48 hours since my departure. I didn't reply to Maxwell. Instead, I forwarded his email to Olivia Tran, the COO of VaultCore, Nexora's most formidable competitor. My message was simple. Might be a good time to move. Olivia and I had met at a conference 2 years earlier and had maintained a professional respect, occasionally catching up over coffee when our paths crossed. She had tried to recruit me multiple times, but I had always declined out of a misplaced sense of loyalty to what I'd built at Nexora. That loyalty had evaporated the moment Reed's whisper reached my ears. On day 3, I took more direct action. I compiled 3 documents. 1. A screenshot from the Zoom call, capturing Reed's fatal whisper in the caption text. 2. A log from Slack showing the timestamps of our resignation emails, arriving while Reed was still speaking about team cohesion. 3. A screenshot of the vendor security alert showing the potentially unauthorized access attempt. I sent these to a technology journalist I'd met at an industry event last year, with a simple note: 3 resignations, 1 mic error, and a system left to rot. No comment needed from me. 2 days later, TechScope published an article that sent shockwaves through the Portland tech community and beyond. 3 resignations, 1 mic error, and a system left to rot. The implosion at Nexora Systems. The article was devastating in its clinical precision, laying out the sequence of events without embellishment. The journalist had done additional research, uncovering that Nexora's stock had dropped 17% since my departure, that 4 more engineers had resigned in solidarity, and that a major client was reconsidering their contract due to infrastructure stability concerns. But the revelation that truly detonated like a bomb was one that even Reed hadn't seen coming, one that I had kept as my final insurance policy. The patent for the core IP framework that powered Nexora's entire infrastructure belonged to me, not the company. 3 years earlier, during a contract renegotiation, Reed had dismissed my request for better compensation and equity, telling me that infrastructure people are replaceable parts, not value creators. Rather than argue, I had quietly filed a patent through an anonymous LLC, covering the unique architecture I'd designed. Reed had signed off on the licensing agreement without reading the fine print, assuming it was just another vendor contract among dozens. Now, Nexora was operating on borrowed time, using my intellectual property without a valid license, since my resignation had triggered a clause terminating the agreement. The company wasn't just falling apart, technically, it was legally vulnerable. The calls from Reed stopped. The desperate texts from executives ceased. Instead, I received a single email from Nexora's legal department, requesting a meeting to discuss intellectual property matters. I didn't respond. Instead, I met Carmen Ellery for coffee at a small cafe in the Pearl District. Carmen was a venture capitalist known for funding infrastructure and security startups, and she had reached out after reading the TechScope article. "I've been watching Nexora for years," she said, stirring her Americano. "Always wondered how they manage such complex operations with such a mediocre technical team. Now I know," she smiled. "It was just you." I shrugged. Not just me. Brian and Louisa were crucial, and there were others who understood pieces of the puzzle. "But you were the architect," Carmen said. "It wasn't a question." "So, what's next for you?" I opened my laptop and showed her a roadmap I'd been developing since my departure. Not a rebuild of what I'd created at Nexora, but something entirely new. A next-generation infrastructure platform designed from the ground up for resilience, self-healing, and transparent governance. "It's not a rebuild," I explained. "It's a replacement." Carmen studied the diagrams, her eyes narrowing with interest. "What do you need to make this happen?" My answer was simple: autonomy, smart money, and no one named Reed. She laughed at that, a genuine sound that suggested she understood exactly what I meant. "I think we can manage that. When can you start?" "I already have." 1 week later, the final act played out exactly as I had anticipated. Reed Callahan was removed as CEO of Nexora Systems by unanimous board decision. The official reason was strategic differences, but everyone in the industry knew the truth. The company announced a temporary restructuring while seeking new technical leadership, but their stock continued to fall. Meanwhile, VaultCore released a product announcement video featuring their new chief architect, me. The system I was building there incorporated all the lessons I'd learned at Nexora. But with none of the compromises or technical debt, it was clean, elegant, and revolutionary. The video went viral within the tech community, not just because of the technology, but because of the timing. While Nexora was imploding, I was already building its replacement. I imagined the scene in Nexora's boardroom when the announcement hit the stunned silence. The dawning realization. Perhaps a presentation slide showing VaultCore's new logo and tagline, "Infrastructure that heals itself," designed by Jenna Rowe. And somewhere in that room, someone would surely whisper the truth that Reed had failed to understand until it was too late. He whispered too loud. But I wasn't there to hear it. I was already building the future. one that wouldn't depend on whispers or secrets or the fragile ego of men who didn't understand the systems that kept their dreams afloat. I was building something that would last, something honest and strong and visible. Because the best revenge isn't watching something burn, it's building something better from the ashes, something so undeniably superior that it makes the original look like a rough draft, a practice run, a lesson learned the hard way. Reed thought he could whisper me out of existence. Instead, he whispered his own company into oblivion, and I was just getting started. The weeks following my departure from Nexora and subsequent appearance in VaultCore's announcement video were a blur of activity. VaultCore had given me free rein to assemble my dream team. And naturally, Brian and Louisa were my first calls. They joined without hesitation, bringing with them their exceptional talents and intimate knowledge of the challenges we'd faced at Nexora. It's like we're getting the band back together. Brian joked during our first meeting at VaultCore's headquarters, a renovated warehouse in southeast Portland with exposed brick walls and massive windows overlooking the Willamette River. Except this time, we actually own the instruments. And the venue, Louisa added with a smile. The metaphor was apt. At Nexora, we'd been talented musicians forced to play on broken instruments, constantly adjusting and improvising to produce something resembling harmony. Now, we had the opportunity to build both the instruments and compose the symphony from scratch. Carmen Ellery had been true to her word about autonomy. Unlike Reed, who had seen technical infrastructure as a necessary evil, a cost center rather than a value driver, Carmen understood that in today's digital economy, the architecture was the product. Everything else was just packaging. I don't need to understand every line of code, she told me during one of our weekly check-ins. I just need to know that you do, and that you can translate the value to our clients. That was a refreshing change from Reed's approach of pretending to understand technical details he clearly didn't grasp, then making decisions that undermined the very systems he depended on. While I was building my new professional home at VaultCore, Nexora continued its spectacular implosion. The TechScope article had been just the beginning. Other technology publications picked up the story, each adding new details about the company's decline. One particularly devastating piece in TechCrunch detailed how Nexora's attempts to rebuild their infrastructure without me had resulted in 3 major outages in 2 weeks, costing them 2 enterprise clients worth over $4 million in annual recurring revenue. I didn't take pleasure in Nexora's pain, well, perhaps a small private satisfaction when I thought about Reed, but I did feel vindicated. The systems I'd built had been complex because they needed to be, not because I'd made them that way to ensure job security, as Reed had apparently suggested to the board after my departure. My shell key and DevOps credential remained unused. I didn't need them anymore. The public unraveling of Nexora provided all the confirmation I needed that my assessment had been correct. The company couldn't function without the architecture I'd created, and they lacked the institutional knowledge to recreate it. About a month after joining VaultCore, I received an unexpected visitor at my new office. Darren Fisher, Nexora's COO, looking considerably more haggard than when I'd last seen him, requested a meeting through VaultCore's reception. Against my better judgment, I agreed to see him. "You look well, Jenna," he said as he sat across from me, his eyes taking in my new surroundings, the spacious office with views of the river, the multiple monitors displaying code and system diagrams, the subtle but unmistakable signs of professional respect that had been absent at Nexora. "What do you want, Darren?" I wasn't interested in small talk. He sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I'll be direct. We need you back." I couldn't help but laugh. "You can't be serious." "Reed is gone," he continued quickly. "The board removed him. I'm interim CEO. And I have authorization to offer you whatever you want. Name your price, your title, your equity stake. We'll match it." I studied him for a moment, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the slightly rumpled shirt, so unlike the impeccably groomed executive I'd known. Nexora's collapse was taking a personal toll. "It's not about the money, Darren. It never was." "Then what autonomy? You'll have complete control over the technical direction, no interference. I leaned forward. You still don't get it. Do you? You can't buy back trust once it's broken. Reed didn't just insult me with that whisper, he revealed how the entire leadership team viewed me. As disposable, as a problem to be eliminated rather than a person to be valued. Darren had the decency to look ashamed. I didn't agree with him. But you didn't stop him either, I countered. And you were perfectly willing to execute his plan until it backfired. So no, I won't be coming back to Nexora. Not for any price. The company will fold without you, he said quietly. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs. That was a low blow. Attempting to leverage my concern for my former colleagues. That's on Reed, not me. And on you and the rest of the leadership who created a company so dependent on individuals that it couldn't survive their departure. That's not a technology problem. Darren, it's a culture problem. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of my words. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I appreciate that, but my answer is still no. After Darren left, I sat at my desk for a long time, watching the river flow past my window. His visit had stirred memories of Nexora, not all of them bad. Despite the dysfunction at the leadership level, I had built something I was proud of there. Something remarkable, given the constraints. But that chapter was closed. VaultCore represented a fresh start, a chance to apply everything I'd learned without the baggage of Nexora's toxic culture. That evening, I called a meeting with Brian, Louisa, and the rest of our growing team. We gathered in VaultCore's main conference room, where I shared my vision for what we were building, not just robust infrastructure, but a new paradigm for how technical teams could operate within organizations. What happened at Nexora wasn't unique. I told them, it's happening at companies everywhere, brilliant technical people being undervalued. Their work misunderstood and taken for granted until something breaks. We have an opportunity to change that narrative. I outlined my plan for a system that would not only be technically superior, but would also make its value visible and understandable to non-technical stakeholders. Transparency built into its very architecture. We're not just building infrastructure, I concluded. We're building a bridge between the people who create the systems and the people who depend on them. A bridge made of mutual respect and clear communication. The team's enthusiasm was palpable. These were people who had experienced the same frustrations I had, who understood the cost of the disconnect between technical reality and executive perception. As we dispersed after the meeting, Carmen pulled me aside. That was inspiring, she said. But I'm curious what happens when Nexora finally collapses completely. Will you feel responsible? I considered her question carefully. I'll feel responsible for not having done more to change their culture while I was there, I admitted. But not for leaving when it became clear that change wasn't possible. Sometimes you have to let go of what you've built so you can build something better. She nodded, satisfied with my answer. That's why I invested in you, Jenna. You understand that creation and destruction are two sides of the same coin. The next morning, I arrived at the office early to find an email from Maxwell Zhang, Nexora's briefly tenured CTO. The subject line was simple, thank you. The body of the email explained that he had resigned from Nexora after just 3 weeks, unable to make headway against the technical and cultural debt that had accumulated. He was returning to his previous company, where he'd been much happier. But before leaving, he'd done something unexpected. He'd convinced the board to release my patent back to me with no conditions, acknowledging that it had been obtained under ethically questionable circumstances. Your architecture was brilliant, he wrote. I couldn't have recreated it even with unlimited time and resources. What Reed did was wrong. And this is a small step toward making it right. I forwarded the email to my lawyer, who confirmed that the patent release was legitimate. Nexora had surrendered its last claim on my intellectual property. It should have felt like victory, but instead, I felt a strange sense of closure. Nexora was no longer my concern either as an adversary or as a responsibility. I was free to focus entirely on building something new at VaultCore. And build we did. Over the next 6 months, our team expanded from the original 3 to 27 engineers, designers, and product specialists. We developed a platform that embodied everything I'd learned about resilient systems, both technical and human. The core innovation wasn't just technical, though the self-healing protocols and transparent governance model were revolutionary. The true breakthrough was in how the system communicated its status and needs to non-technical users. We created visualizations that made complex dependencies intuitive, dashboards that translated technical metrics into business impacts, and automated documentation that evolved alongside the code. In essence, we built a system that couldn't be misunderstood or taken for granted, one that made its value visible and its maintenance requirements clear, one that respected both the people who built it and the people who used it. When we launched the beta version to our first enterprise clients, the response exceeded even Carmen's optimistic projections. Companies didn't just want our technology, they wanted to transform their entire approach to infrastructure using our methodology. Olivia Tran, who had become not just a colleague, but a friend, called me the day after our first major client announcement. "Have you seen Nexora's stock today?" she asked without preamble. I hadn't. I'd stopped tracking Nexora's decline weeks ago. "They're filing for Chapter 11. Olivia continued. "Restructuring. The press release says they're pivoting to focus on core competencies and seeking strategic partnerships." In corporate speak, it was an admission of defeat. Nexora couldn't survive as an independent entity. "How do you feel?" Olivia asked after a moment of silence. I considered the question. "Validated," I said finally, "but not celebratory. Too many good people are caught in that collapse." "Well, you might be interested to know that we've received job applications from 17 former Nexora employees in the last 2 hours," Olivia said, "including some senior people who might actually be valuable. Any names I'd recognize?" "A few. I've forwarded the most interesting ones to your inbox." After we hung up, I checked my email to find that one of the applications was from Marcus, a talented engineer who had been on my team at Nexora. His cover letter was candid. "I should have left when you did. I stayed out of misplaced loyalty and fear of change. I've learned my lesson. I want to build something that lasts, with people who understand the value of what we create." I called him immediately and offered him a position on my team. His experience at Nexora both before and after my departure would be invaluable as we continued to refine our approach. That evening, as I walked home along the riverfront, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. Reed's whispered, "Let's just fire her after this," quietly, had been intended as my ending. Instead, it had been the beginning of something far more significant than either of us could have imagined. In trying to whisper me out of existence, Reed had actually amplified my voice. In attempting to diminish my value, he had created the conditions for me to demonstrate it more powerfully than ever before. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the lesson sometimes the worst moments in our professional lives are actually doorways to something better. But you have to be willing to walk through them, even when the other side is uncertain. 6 months after joining VaultCore, I received an invitation to speak at Tech Forum, the premier conference for infrastructure and systems architecture in the Pacific Northwest. My presentation, titled Resilient Systems, Resilient Teams, Building Infrastructure That Survives Leadership Failures, was scheduled as the keynote address. As I stood on the stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, some familiar, some new, all attentive, I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing during my final years at Nexora. "Infrastructure is invisible," I began, "until it fails. The same is true of the people who build and maintain it. We become visible only in moments of crisis, when systems are breaking and data is at risk. That invisibility is both a feature and a bug of our profession." I shared the story of my departure from Nexora not as a tale of personal vindication, but as a case study in systemic failure. How organizations that treat technical infrastructure as a cost center rather than a core value proposition are building on foundations of sand. How leadership that doesn't understand or value the complexity of what their technical teams create is destined to lose those teams and eventually their companies. But there's a better way, I continued, revealing the architecture we'd developed at VaultCore. We can build systems that make their value visible, that communicate their needs clearly, that resist failure not just technically, but organizationally. Systems that bridge the gap between those who build and those who lead. The response was overwhelming. After the presentation, I was surrounded by engineers, architects, and technical leaders who shared similar experiences: the frustration of being undervalued, the struggle to communicate technical complexity to non-technical leadership, the difficult decisions about when to stay and when to walk away. One conversation in particular stood out. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, approached me with a mix of admiration and uncertainty in her eyes. "I'm in exactly the position you were in at Nexora," she said quietly. "Building systems no one else understands, feeling invisible until something breaks. My CEO thinks infrastructure is a necessary evil rather than a competitive advantage. What would you tell someone like me?" I considered her question carefully. "Document everything," I said finally. "Not just the technical details, but the business value. Make visible what others can't see. Build alliances with colleagues who understand your worth. And most importantly, know your value even if others don't yet recognize it." She nodded, absorbing my words. "And if that doesn't work, then find somewhere that will value what you build." I said simply, "There are leaders like Carmen Ellery out there who understand that infrastructure is the foundation everything else is built on. Find them." As the conference wrapped up, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in just 6 months. From the desperate 72-hour system rescue at Nexora to standing on stage as a keynote speaker and industry thought leader. From being someone whose value could be dismissed in a careless whisper to someone whose ideas were reshaping how companies approached infrastructure architecture. The final confirmation of this transformation came unexpectedly. As I was gathering my things to leave the venue, a tall, distinguished man approached me, his hand extended. "Ms. Roe Thomas Ellison, from Venture Capital Quarterly. I wonder if you'd be willing to give me a few minutes of your time." I recognized the name immediately. Venture Capital Quarterly was the publication that tech CEOs and investors read religiously. An interview there would amplify Vaultcore's message to exactly the audience we wanted to reach. "What's your angle, Mr. Ellison?" I asked directly. He smiled, appreciating my candor. "I'm writing a piece on the shifting power dynamics in tech. How critical technical talent is increasingly setting the terms of engagement rather than accepting what's offered. Your story is the perfect illustration." I agreed to the interview, and we found a quiet corner in the now emptying conference hall. His questions were incisive, focused not just on what had happened at Nexora, but on the larger implications for the industry. "Do you think what happened to Nexora could happen to other companies?" he asked. "It's already happening," I replied. "Companies that treat their technical infrastructure and the people who build it as disposable or interchangeable are creating existential risks for themselves. The Great Resignation isn't just about remote work or compensation. It's about recognition and respect. And your solution? Build organizations where technical excellence is understood as a core value, not a cost center. Where infrastructure architects have a seat at the leadership table. Where systems are designed for resilience not just against technical failures, but against organizational ones." As the interview concluded, Ellison asked one final question. "Have you heard anything from Reed Callahan since his departure from Nexora?" I shook my head. "No, and I don't expect to. Our paths have diverged completely." "Actually," Ellison said, checking something on his phone, "I heard a rumor that he's starting a new venture, something in the crypto space. Apparently, he's telling investors he learned valuable lessons from Nexora's collapse." I couldn't help but laugh. I hope that's true. For his sake and for whoever joins his new company. "You're more generous than many would be in your position," Ellison observed. "It's not generosity," I clarified. "It's pragmatism. What happened at Nexora wasn't just about Reed, though his leadership certainly accelerated the collapse. It was about a systemic failure to value what couldn't be easily seen or measured. If Reed has genuinely learned from that, then something positive came from the experience." After Ellison left, I stood alone in the conference hall, feeling a sense of completion. The Nexora chapter of my story was truly closed now. What lay ahead was the opportunity to build something lasting at VaultCore, something that embodied the lessons I'd learned through both success and failure. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen Dinner to celebrate your keynote. The team is gathering at Rivera's at 8. I smiled and replied, on my way, order the champagne. As I left the venue, stepping into the crisp evening air, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange alchemy that had transformed Reed's whispered dismissal into the catalyst for my greatest professional achievement. The words that were meant to end my career had instead launched it to new heights. He thought he could whisper me out of existence, but his mic was on, and I was the only reason the company hadn't collapsed already. So I let go and watched the system choke on its own secrets. But more importantly, I built something better in its place. Something that wouldn't depend on whispers or secrets. Something transparent, resilient, and valued. Something that would last. The quarterly VaultCore board meeting fell exactly 1 year after Reed's fateful whisper and my subsequent resignation from Nexora. It seemed fitting to use the occasion to reflect on how far we'd come and where we were headed. Carmen had arranged for the meeting to be held in VaultCore's newest conference room, a space specifically designed for bridging the gap between technical and non-technical stakeholders. The room featured interactive displays where complex system architectures could be visualized in ways that made their value and dependencies clear to everyone, regardless of their technical background. As the board members took their seats, a diverse group that included venture capitalists, industry veterans, and 2 senior engineers elected by the technical team. I couldn't help but contrast this scene with the boardroom at Nexora, where technical voices had been conspicuously absent from strategic discussions. Before we dive into the quarterly results, I began. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the anniversary that some of you might be aware of. I glanced at Brian and Louisa, who smiled knowingly. Exactly 1 year ago today, a microphone that should have been muted wasn't, and a whispered comment set in motion the chain of events that brought many of us together. There were knowing nods around the table. The story of Nexora's collapse and VaultCore's rise had become something of a legend in the Portland tech community and beyond. I mention this not to dwell on the past, but because it embodies the philosophy that has guided us this year. Transparency isn't just a value we espouse. It's a principle we've built into our technology and our company culture. I activated the main display, which showed a real-time visualization of VaultCore's core platform, a living, breathing ecosystem of interconnected services, data flows, and user interactions. Unlike traditional system diagrams, this one translated technical metrics into business impacts, making visible the otherwise invisible value of robust infrastructure. This is what we've built together. I continued. Not just a platform, but a new way of understanding and communicating the value of technical infrastructure. And the market has responded. The numbers spoke for themselves. In 1 year, VaultCore had secured 27 enterprise clients, including 3 that had migrated directly from Nexora. Our revenue growth had exceeded projections by 132%, and our engineering team had grown from the original 3 to 47. With a retention rate of 98%, practically unheard of in the volatile tech industry. But perhaps the metric I'm most proud of, I said, switching to a different visualization. Is this one? The screen displayed the results of our quarterly team survey, where we measured not just satisfaction, but the degree to which people felt their work was understood and valued by leadership. The score was 97%. At Nexora, technical talent was seen as replaceable. Infrastructure was treated as a cost center rather than a value driver. The result was a company built on a foundation that couldn't support its own weight. I explained, at VaultCore, we've inverted that model. We've made the invisible visible. We've built a company where technical excellence isn't just supported, it's celebrated. Carmen took over at this point, walking the board through the financial details of our growth and our projections for the coming year. As she spoke, I observed the board members' engagement, noting how different it was from the glazed expressions I'd seen during technical presentations at Nexora. Here, everyone understood that technology wasn't separate from the business. It was the business. After the meeting concluded, Carmen pulled me aside. "I've got news," she said, her expression a mix of excitement and hesitation. "Nexora's assets are going up for auction next month. The patents, the client list, what's left of the codebase." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we bid on them?" She shrugged. "It could be strategic. Prevent a competitor from acquiring them. Maybe salvage some valuable components." I considered the idea. There was a certain poetic justice in the possibility of VaultCore acquiring the remnants of Nexora, but it also felt like looking backward when we were so focused on moving forward. "Let me think about it," I said. "There might be some value in the client relationships, if nothing else." Later that evening, I discussed the possibility with Brian and Louisa over drinks at our regular spot, a small bar near the office with a view of the Willamette River. "Personally, I'd rather leave Nexora in the past," Brian said, swirling his whiskey. "We've built something better. Why complicate it with ghosts?" Louisa was more pragmatic. "The client list could be valuable. Many of them probably still need what we're offering, and they've already learned the hard way what happens when infrastructure fails." I nodded, seeing merit in both perspectives. "What about the team members who stayed? There were good people there who just didn't have the luxury of walking away like we did." "Most of the ones worth hiring have already found new positions," Brian pointed out, "some of them with us." "True," I acknowledged, "but it still feels like there's unfinished business there." The next morning, I made a decision. I called Carmen and told her that VaultCore wouldn't be bidding on Nexora's assets with one exception. We would reach out to former Nexora clients who hadn't yet found a stable replacement for their infrastructure needs and offer them a migration path to VaultCore, with special terms that acknowledged their situation. "It's not about acquiring assets," I explained. "It's about providing a soft landing for users who were caught in the crossfire of Nexora's collapse. It's the right thing to do, and it's good business." Carmen agreed, and we set the plan in motion. Over the next few weeks, our business development team reached out to former Nexora clients, many of whom were still struggling with unstable systems cobbled together after the company's implosion. The response was overwhelmingly positive. By the time Nexora's assets went to auction, VaultCore had already secured agreements with 14 former Nexora clients to migrate to our platform. The value of those agreements far exceeded what we would have paid for the formal client list. The auction itself made barely a ripple in the tech press. Nexora, once valued at over $300 million, saw its remains sold for pennies on the dollar to a holding company that specialized in liquidating failed startups. Reed Callahan's name wasn't mentioned in any of the coverage. As for Reed himself, I heard through industry gossip that his crypto venture had failed to gain traction. Investors, it seemed, had become wary of his leadership after the Nexora debacle. The last I heard, he had taken a mid-level executive position at a legacy tech company on the East Coast, about as far from the cutting-edge startup world of Portland as one could get while still remaining in the industry. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. What had happened to Nexora wasn't about personal vendettas. It was about systemic failures. Reed had been a symptom, not the disease. The real problem had been a culture that devalued the very infrastructure it depended on, that treated technical expertise as a commodity rather than a core competency. At VaultCore, we were building the antidote to that culture. Our success wasn't just measured in revenue growth or client acquisitions, but in the sustainable, resilient organization we were creating, one where technical excellence and business success were recognized as two sides of the same coin. 18 months after that fateful Zoom call, VaultCore had grown to over 100 employees, with offices in Portland, Seattle, and Austin. Our platform had become the gold standard for resilient infrastructure in industries ranging from healthcare to finance to education. And I had transitioned from chief architect to CEO, with Carmen's enthusiastic backing and the unanimous support of the board. My first act as CEO was to establish a new tradition, the annual Infrastructure Visibility Day, when our entire company, from engineers to salespeople to finance, would spend a day understanding and celebrating the often invisible work that made everything else possible. It was a day to make the hidden visible, to bridge the gaps between technical and non-technical roles, to ensure that no one at VaultCore would ever feel undervalued or misunderstood. During that first Infrastructure Visibility Day, as I watched teams collaborating across traditional boundaries, I couldn't help but reflect on how a single whispered comment had set all of this in motion. Reed had whispered, "Let's just fire her after this." Quietly, never imagining that his microphone was on, never considering that those 8 words would not only end his leadership of Nixora, but would catalyze the creation of something far more valuable in its place. In trying to make me invisible, he had inadvertently made me, and the critical infrastructure I represented, more visible than ever before. In attempting to dismiss my value, he had created the conditions for that value to be recognized and amplified beyond anything I could have achieved had I stayed at Nixora. It was a lesson I carried with me into my leadership of VaultCore Visibility Matters. Understanding matters, respect matters, not just as abstract values, but as concrete practices built into the very architecture of our technology and our organization. As the day wound down, I found myself standing with Brian and Louisa on the rooftop terrace of our Portland headquarters, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of gold and purple. We had come so far from those frantic 72-hour system rescues at Nixora, from feeling undervalued and misunderstood, from having our expertise dismissed with a careless whisper. "Do you ever miss it?" Louisa asked suddenly. The early days at Nixora, before everything went sideways, there was something exciting about building something from nothing, even with all the challenges. I considered her question carefully. I missed the potential of what Nixora could have been, I admitted, but not what it actually was. What we've built here is what Nixora should have been, a place where technical excellence is understood as the foundation of everything else. Brian raised his glass in a toast. To making the invisible visible. Louisa and I joined him to making the invisible visible. As we stood there, looking out over the city where our professional journey together had begun, ended, and begun again, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for Reed's whispered words, not because they had hurt, but because they had freed me to build something better. Something that wouldn't depend on whispers or secrets or the fragile ego of leaders who didn't understand the systems that kept their dreams afloat. He thought he could whisper me out of existence, but his mic was on, and I was the only reason the company hadn't collapsed already. So I let go and watched the system choke on its own secrets. But I didn't just watch. I built, I created, I transformed. And in doing so, I turned a whispered ending into a beginning, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible in the shadows of the systems they created. For everyone who had ever had their value questioned by those who depended on their expertise without understanding it. Reed's whisper hadn't destroyed me, it had amplified me. And the company I built in response wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, visible for all to see. 2 years to the day after Reed's fateful whisper, I stood on stage at the Global Infrastructure Summit in San Francisco, delivering the keynote address to an audience of thousands. The title of my presentation was simple but powerful: The Value of Being Heard. As I looked out at the sea of faces, technical leaders, business executives, entrepreneurs, and investors from around the world, I thought about how far the conversation about technical infrastructure had evolved in just 2 years. What had once been considered a back-office function, a necessary evil, was now recognized as a strategic advantage, a core competency, a source of resilience and innovation. VaultCore had played a significant role in that evolution. Our platform, with its emphasis on transparency and accessibility, had helped bridge the gap between technical complexity and business value. Our success had demonstrated that when infrastructure is visible and valued, everything built upon it becomes stronger. The systems we build are only as resilient as the organizations that create and maintain them. I told the audience, technical architecture and organizational architecture must evolve together, supporting and reinforcing each other. When they fall out of alignment, when those who build the systems are undervalued by those who depend on them, failure becomes inevitable. I shared the story of Nixora's collapse and VaultCore's rise not as a personal narrative, but as a case study in systemic failure and renewal. I didn't mention Reed by name or dwell on the specifics of his whispered dismissal. This wasn't about individual villains and heroes, it was about patterns that played out across the industry. The most dangerous threats to our systems often aren't technical failures, but communication failures. I continued. When expertise is dismissed, when complexity is oversimplified, when value is invisible until it's absent, that's when organizations become vulnerable to collapse. As I concluded my presentation, I unveiled VaultCore's newest initiative, an open-source framework for making technical infrastructure visible and understandable to non-technical stakeholders. We were taking the visualization tools we'd developed for our own platform and making them available to the broader community, along with educational resources and best practices for bridging the gap between technical and business leadership. Because this isn't just about VaultCore or any single company, I explained. It's about transforming how our industry values the invisible architecture that makes everything else possible. It's about ensuring that no one's expertise is ever again dismissed with a whisper. The response was overwhelming. As I stepped off the stage, I was immediately surrounded by people wanting to share their own stories of being undervalued, of building critical systems that went unrecognized until they failed, of struggling to communicate complex technical value to non-technical leadership. One conversation in particular stood out. A young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, approached me with a determined expression. "Your story changed my career," she said without preamble. "I was in a situation just like yours at Nixora, building critical infrastructure that no one understood or valued. After hearing about what happened to you, I realized I had two choices: stay and be undervalued, or leave and build something better." "What did you choose?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. She smiled. "I left. Started my own consultancy focused on infrastructure resilience for mid-sized companies. We're small but growing, and every client we work with understands from day one that infrastructure isn't a cost center. It's a competitive advantage." I felt a surge of pride not in myself, but in her and all the technical architects and engineers who were refusing to remain invisible, who were insisting that their expertise be recognized and valued. That's exactly why we're releasing our visualization framework as open source. I told her, to give people like you more tools to make your value visible. She nodded enthusiastically. "We'll be first in line to implement it." And she hesitated before continuing. "I was wondering if you might be open to a conversation about potential collaboration. There's so much alignment between what VaultCore is doing at the enterprise level and what we're doing for smaller organizations." We exchanged contact information, and I promised to have my team follow up. As she walked away, I realized that this was perhaps the most meaningful impact of what had happened 2 years ago, not just the creation of VaultCore, but the inspiration for countless others to demand recognition for the essential work they did. Later that evening, at a reception for summit speakers and industry leaders, I found myself in conversation with Thomas Ellison from Venture Capital Quarterly, who had interviewed me shortly after my keynote at Tech Forum. "Your star continues to rise," he observed, gesturing around the room where numerous attendees were discussing my presentation. "VaultCore is being mentioned in the same breath as companies 10 times your size and age." I smiled. It's not about size or age. It's about understanding what truly matters in building resilient systems, both technical and organizational. "Speaking of which," Ellison said, lowering his voice slightly, "I thought you might be interested to know that Reed Callahan was here earlier. He left right after your keynote." I felt a momentary jolt of surprise. I hadn't seen Reed since leaving Nixora, and I'd had no idea he was attending the summit. "Did you speak with him?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Ellison nodded. "Briefly, he's working for Meridian Systems now, in their legacy modernization division. When I mentioned I knew you, he seemed uncomfortable. I could imagine. Having your former employee, the one you tried to fire with a whispered aside, become a keynote speaker and industry thought leader, while you transitioned to a mid-level position at a conventional company would be uncomfortable for anyone, especially someone with Reed's ego. "I hope he's doing well," I said, and meant it. Reed's failure had never been my goal. It had simply been the inevitable consequence of his own actions and the system he'd created. He said something interesting, Ellison continued. He said that Nexera's collapse was the most expensive lesson he ever learned, but worth every penny. I thought you might appreciate knowing that. I did appreciate it, not out of any sense of vindication, but because it suggested that something positive had come from the experience, that Reed had gained insight that might make him a better leader in his current role. We all learn from failure, I said. Some lessons are just more costly than others. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the hotel balcony, looking out at the San Francisco skyline. 2 years ago, I had been standing on my apartment balcony in Portland, eating raspberries and watching the beginning of Nexera's collapse. Now, I was leading a company valued at over $200 million, speaking at global summits, and influencing how the entire industry thought about infrastructure architecture. The irony wasn't lost on me. Reed's attempt to remove me had instead removed him and elevated me beyond anything I could have achieved had I stayed at Nexera. His whispered, "Let's just fire her after this," quietly had been transformed from a threat into an opportunity, from an ending into a beginning. My phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Your keynote is trending on tech Twitter. Vault Core mentioned in WSJ tomorrow. We're no longer the underdog story, we're the success story." I smiled and texted back, "Success is just the beginning. We're just getting started." And we were. The open source framework we'd announced was just the first step in a larger vision, one where technical infrastructure was universally recognized as a strategic asset rather than a necessary cost, where the people who built and maintained that infrastructure were valued for their expertise, where the invisible was made visible before it failed. Reed had tried to whisper me out of existence. Instead, he had whispered me into a position of influence I could never have imagined. His mic had been on, and now my voice was being heard by the entire industry. He thought he could whisper me out of existence, but his mic was on, and I was the only reason the company hadn't collapsed already. So I let go and watched the system choke on its own secrets. And in their place, I built something transparent, something resilient, something that made the invisible visible, something that would last.